On a barren stretch of prairie, a poor rancher named Caleb stumbled upon a sight that stole his breath: a wounded Apache woman, her beauty fierce even in pain. He should have left her, for helping meant danger. But his heart would not let him walk away. Through sleepless nights he tended her wounds, and in the quiet glow of firelight, trust grew where fear once lived. By sunrise, the town whispered scandal, yet neither Caleb nor the woman cared. For in the shadow of hardship, they had found something rare: hope, tenderness, the beginning of a love that no frontier law could forbid. What happened next would bind their fates forever. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The prairie stretched wide and merciless beneath a sky the color of hammered copper, the sun sinking toward the horizon like a dying ember, and Caleb, slouched in his saddle with dust caked in the lines of his face, felt the weight of hunger and unpaid debts press down heavier than the tools strapped to his horse. The fields he left behind lay cracked and barren, the cattle growing thin as ghosts, and though he had always considered himself a man of endurance, the days had begun to feel like a punishment without reprieve. Yet still he rode because motion, however weary, was better than sitting still and waiting for ruin. And it was in this hour of despair that his tired eyes caught something strange against the broken rocks and wild grass, something that didn't belong, a shape twisted on the ground as though the earth itself had tried to swallow it whole. An instinct pulled him closer, suspicion rising like a knife blade in his chest, until at last the truth revealed itself: a woman, her dress torn, her skin bronzed by the sun, her dark hair tangled with burrs, her breath shallow but stubborn, and protruding from her side, cruel and jagged, was the broken shaft of an arrow. Caleb's pulse quickened as realization struck, for the beadwork at her sleeve and the proud line of her cheek made it clear who she was: Apache, the very people the town cursed over whiskey and warned their children about at night. And for a moment his body went rigid, every story of raids and ambushes ringing in his ears, every warning from neighbors telling him not to show mercy to those who would not show it in return. And though a part of him longed to wheel his horse around, to leave her to the dust and the vultures, another part, deeper and more human, would not let him move. For when her eyes opened dark, fierce, unwilling to surrender, he saw not an enemy but a soul caught between life and death. And when her hand lifted weakly, fingers clawing at the dirt in defiance of mortality, Caleb felt something break inside him, something that reminded him of his own struggles against a land that refused to yield. Dismounting slowly, his boots crunching over dry earth, he knelt beside her, the smell of blood sharp in his nostrils, his rough hands hovering before settling gently on her shoulder, whispering words she might not understand, promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "You're gonna be all right, I've got you now." And with those words, spoken as much to steady his own trembling resolve as to comfort her, he made a choice that no man in town would forgive, lifting her fragile weight into his arms, feeling her head fall against his chest. And in that moment, as the first stars began to pierce the twilight, Caleb knew he had crossed an invisible line, one that tethered his fate to hers and set into motion a story that would soon ripple through every saloon, ranch, and homestead west of the Pecos. A story born not from hate or duty but from the dangerous, reckless mercy of a poor rancher who could not let a wounded Apache beauty die alone on the prairie. Caleb's cabin stood weather-beaten on the edge of his failing ranch, its timbers warped by years of wind and sun, the roof patched with whatever scrap he could scavenge. A poor man's shelter, but the only refuge he could offer. And as he pushed open the door with his shoulder, cradling the wounded Apache woman in his arms, the smell of dry wood and smoke clung to the air, mingling with the metallic tang of her blood. He laid her carefully on the narrow cot against the wall, its straw mattress sagging, and for a moment he just stood over her, chest heaving, torn between the voices screaming in his head, "Leave her, you fool. She'll bring ruin," and the quiet pulse of compassion that drove him to this moment. And with shaking hands he lit the old oil lamp on the table, its glow spilling across her face, highlighting the sharp contrast of strength and fragility in her features. Her skin pale with blood loss, yet her eyes open, unwavering, watching him not with hatred nor suspicion but with the weary acceptance of one who has endured too much suffering to waste energy on fear. He reached for a basin, filling it with the little water he had left, and tore strips from an old shirt to fashion crude bandages, his calloused fingers clumsy yet careful as he worked to clean the wound, each touch earning a flinch, each breath she drew shallow and strained. And though they had no words between them, his English meaningless to her, her tongue foreign to him, there was a strange language in the silence, a fragile understanding that he was not her enemy in this moment, that survival depended on trust. The arrowhead had broken off beneath her skin, and with a grimace Caleb used the tip of his knife to dig it free, her low cry cutting through the cabin like a blade, and he paused, whispering softly, "Easy now, just a little more." Though he knew she could not understand, yet his voice seemed to steady her, and at last the shard came loose, clattering into the basin like the toll of a bell, a symbol of the danger she carried inside her now gone. He pressed the bandage firm, wrapping it around her side, his hand steadying as he worked, and when it was done he sat back on the stool, staring at her in the lamplight, struck by the realization that he had crossed a boundary far deeper than tending a wound. He had chosen to stand in defiance of his neighbor's prejudice, of the rules unspoken but ironclad in this land. She lay breathing softly, eyes closing at last, her strength surrendering to exhaustion, and Caleb, watching the rise and fall of her chest, felt the first stirrings of something he could not name, something dangerous and tender all at once, and though the silence between them remained heavy, it no longer felt hostile but strangely intimate. The cabin itself transformed by her presence into a place of quiet secrets, and as the lamp flickered low, casting shadows against the rough-hewn walls, Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and whispered to himself, "Lord, help me. What have I done?" Knowing full well that whatever road lay ahead, it began here, in this secret act of mercy that no one could ever understand, an act that would change the course of both their lives. The nights that followed stretched long and heavy across the prairie, the wind scraping against the shutters of Caleb's cabin like a restless spirit, and within those thin wooden walls the rhythm of survival took on a new shape, for each evening after his weary chores were done hauling what little water the well still offered, scattering feed to the gaunt cattle, mending fences half-rotted by time, he would return to her side, to the fragile figure lying on his cot, her strength flickering like a candle in the wind yet refusing to go out, and with patience born of desperation he tended her wound, cleaning it with water heated over the fire, pressing clean cloth against her side, listening to the faintest hitch in her breathing whenever pain struck, and though no words bridged the gap between them, something subtler began to grow in those silent exchanges, a language of glances and gestures, of his steady hands offering sustenance and her reluctant acceptance of it. The first time she managed to lift the cup to her lips without trembling, Caleb felt a surge of relief that startled him, like a father watching a child's first step. But it was the look she gave him afterward, a fleeting, hesitant glance that carried the weight of gratitude, that marked the turning point. For in her eyes he no longer saw only defiance but something softer, cautious trust beginning to stir. Days turned to nights and back again, the passage of time measured by the slow healing of her wound, and the moments that passed between them, her fingers brushing his as she took bread from his hand, his brief smile when she whispered a single word, "Thank you," the syllables broken, halting, but enough to send a shiver through him because it meant she had chosen to reach toward his world rather than remain closed within her own. And as the fire crackled low each night, casting its glow across her resting face, Caleb found himself watching longer than he should, tracing the lines of strength that even suffering could not erase, until at last one evening she met his gaze and did not look away, the silence thick with something neither dared name. Yet it was not just tender moments that wove their bond, but the weight of shared hardship, for she began to rise from the bed, moving slowly, helping him in small ways, passing tools, gathering wood from just outside the cabin, even humming a melody soft and low while he worked each act a thread binding her presence more firmly into his life. And Caleb, who had long carried loneliness like a second skin, began to feel it loosen, replaced by something dangerous and sweet, a warmth that grew not from duty but from the spark of companionship. He would sit by the fire after she had fallen asleep, staring into the flames, whispering to himself, "What am I doing?" Yet his hands never faltered when he tended her. His resolve never wavered when he looked into her eyes. And though fear of discovery gnawed at him with every dawn, in those stolen nights he found a fragile kind of peace, the kind that told him he was no longer alone, and even if the world outside judged them, here, within these four walls, a bond was taking root, a bond born of mercy but blooming into something far greater, something neither of them had expected and both of them, silently, had begun to need. The first whisper rose on the wind before Caleb ever heard it, carried from the dusty lane where Old Man Peterson paused by his corral and squinted at the unfamiliar paint horse tethered near Caleb's barn. Its saddle stripped but its markings unlike any beast known in town, and by the time Peterson shuffled back to the mercantile, the story had already grown teeth. Caleb, the poor rancher clinging to ruined land, had taken in something he shouldn't, and when he stopped by the saloon that evening, feigning his usual indifference, he could feel the shift in the air, the hush that followed his steps, the way men's voices dropped as though his presence dragged a shadow with it, and at the bar, over cracked mugs of whiskey, the words slithered out plain enough. "He's harboring an Apache. And a woman," spoken with the sneer of certainty, repeated with the relish of scandal. By the second round the whispers had become judgment, men recalling every misfortune of the town's stolen cattle, missing travelers, raided wagons, and laying them at the feet of the Apache, their suspicion sharpened now by the rumor that one lay hidden in Caleb's very home, and worse still, that she was a woman, which carried implications no one dared speak outright but which hung in the air like smoke, poisoning it. Caleb, sitting silent in the corner, hat pulled low, felt the weight of their stares burn hotter than the prairie sun, and though no one confronted him directly, the message was clear: he had crossed a line they would not forgive. On his way out, a younger ranch hand muttered too loudly, "Oughta run him out with her," and Caleb's fists clenched at his sides, though he forced himself to keep walking, boots echoing against the wooden boards, his jaw tight with the knowledge that every step home carried danger now. When he reached his cabin that night, the lamplight spilling from the window seemed fragile against the dark, and inside, she sat by the fire, her wound healing but her presence still secret, still precarious, and though her eyes searched his face with unspoken questions, he could not bring himself to tell her what was being said in town, that neighbors he had once called friends now watched him with suspicion, that their disapproval was curdling into something sharper, heavier, the kind of judgment that could drive a man from his land. Instead, he sat across from her, the fire between them both a comfort and a warning, and as she offered him the smallest of smiles, trusting him without knowing the peril it placed him in, Caleb felt both the ache of fear and the stubborn swell of resolve. For whatever storm the town brewed, he could not turn back now, not after choosing mercy, not after the bond that had begun to grow, and if the world saw sin or betrayal in his act, then so be it, he would carry that burden, though he knew the whispers would only grow louder, and the judgment heavier, with every passing day. The sheriff came riding out one blistering afternoon, the sky white-hot and the cicadas screaming in the brush, his horse kicking up dust as it halted in front of Caleb's cabin. And when Caleb stepped onto the porch, wiping sweat from his brow, he already knew this was not a neighborly visit but the kind of call that left a man's stomach knotted. Sheriff Dillard, broad-shouldered and iron-eyed, dismounted slow, his spurs jangling like warning bells, and he looked at Caleb with the grim expression of someone who carried both the law and the town's suspicions on his back. Then, without wasting words, he said what Caleb dreaded to hear. "They're talkin'. Son, say you've got an Apache woman hid out here," his voice calm but edged with steel. And though Caleb tried to hold his face steady, he felt heat rise in his chest, not from the sun but from the sharpness of truth exposed. And when he answered, his voice came quiet, almost defiant. "What if I do?" The sheriff narrowed his eyes, stepped closer, lowering his tone as though speaking plain would soften the blow. "You know what they'll do if it's true. This town won't forgive it, won't stand for it. Not now, not ever. And I can't shield you from that storm, Caleb. You need to send her away before things get ugly." But even as the words hung heavy between them, Caleb's mind went back to the nights of tending her wounds, to the moments by the fire when she whispered halting English, to the way her eyes had softened with trust, and he felt the pull of something deeper than duty, something dangerous yet undeniable. And so he shook his head, steady and firm. "I won't!" She stays. The words costing him more than money ever could, for with them he severed himself from the last thread of approval the town might have offered. The sheriff sighed, rubbing a hand across his weathered jaw, his gaze drifting toward the cabin as if he could see through the walls to where she might be watching. Then he muttered, "You're making a hard bed to lie in. "Son, and I reckon you'll have to lie in it alone," before swinging back into his saddle, leaving a churn of dust and unspoken warnings in his wake. Caleb stood there long after the hoofbeats faded, his fists clenched at his sides, his throat tight with the weight of what he had chosen. And when he finally stepped back inside, the woman her name he had learned was Ahioka looked at him with questioning eyes, her hand resting against her side where the wound had nearly healed, and though she could not fully understand the words exchanged outside, she seemed to sense the heaviness of his silence, offering him a tentative smile that made his chest ache with both fear and longing, for he knew the cost of his choice would only rise, that neighbors would turn cold, that doors would close. And yet as her gaze lingered on his, steady and unafraid, Caleb felt the resolve settle deep in his bones. If loyalty to the town meant abandoning her, then he no longer belonged to the town, and whatever isolation came, he would bear it, because some lines, once crossed, became the only truth a man could live by. The sun sank low, painting the horizon in strokes of fire and violet, the prairie stretching endless beneath the sky, and for the first time in weeks Caleb and Ahioka stepped beyond the confines of the cabin, their silhouettes long and wavering in the dusk light. The tension of watchful eyes lifted for a precious moment, because out here, away from the dusty roads that led into town and the neighbors' suspicious stares, the only witness was the wind itself. She walked slowly, still healing, her steps cautious but deliberate, and Caleb kept close, matching her pace without pressing, his hand occasionally brushing hers in a fleeting contact that neither drew away from. And when they paused near a ridge overlooking the tall grass swaying like an ocean, Ahioka's gaze fixed far beyond the horizon, as though searching for something lost in memory, her voice quiet but steady as she began to share fragments of her story. Broken English carrying the weight of whole worlds, family taken in raids, trust shattered by treaties made and broken, nights of fleeing under moonlight with nothing but will to keep her alive, and though her words faltered, though sometimes silence filled the gaps where her language could not carry her, the truth bled through. Loss had been her shadow, betrayal her constant companion, and yet here she stood, alive, her spirit unbroken. Caleb listened with a heaviness in his chest, not daring to interrupt, his heart swelling with both sorrow and admiration. For in her pain he saw not weakness but a strength carved by suffering, a strength he could scarcely imagine, and he thought of his own burdens, debt, drought, loneliness that had once felt insurmountable, now humbled beside hers. And as she turned her dark eyes toward him, searching his face for judgment, she found none, only the quiet sincerity of a man who saw her as more than an enemy, more than a wound carried into his home, but as a human soul who had endured and refused to bow. She smiled faintly, almost shyly, the first true smile he had seen from her, and it caught him off guard, softening the edges of his weariness, filling the hollow spaces in his chest with something he had not known in years. And when she reached out, fingertips brushing the back of his hand, it was not a gesture of need but of choice, an offering of trust that warmed him more than the fading sun. Together they stood in silence as the prairie shifted into night, coyotes yipping in the distance, the scent of sage riding the breeze, and Caleb, staring at the fragile yet unshakable woman beside him, felt a peace he had not known since boyhood, a peace that told him this bond was no longer born of chance or mercy but of something deeper, something neither of them had expected yet both desperately needed. And as the stars flickered awake in the sky, he whispered softly, almost to himself, "You're safe here." And though her English was halting, her reply was clear enough. "With you." Yes, a simple truth that bound them more tightly than any law or vow could, a fragile promise carved into the heart of the frontier night. The confrontation came on a brittle morning when the sky hung gray, and the air carried the bite of an oncoming storm, the kind that made even the cattle restless. And Caleb knew before the first knock rattled the cabin door that trouble had arrived because he had seen the riders from a distance. 4 of them, neighbors once called friends, men whose faces he recognized from Sunday gatherings and from long days of branding cattle, now standing stiff in their saddles with suspicion burning in their eyes. When they dismounted, boots sinking into the dust, their voices rose sharp and unyielding. "We know she's in there, Caleb. You're bringing shame and danger on this town. Hand her over before worse comes of it." And though Caleb planted himself in the doorway, hat low, jaw set, the weight of their anger pressing heavy against his chest. He refused to step aside, his voice steady but quiet. "She's no threat to you. Leave us be." Yet his words only fanned the fire. Their accusations tumbling out, she was an Apache. She belonged to a people who had taken lives, burned homesteads, stolen stock, and every sentence came like a stone hurled at his resolve, each one daring him to falter. But before his temper could spill over, before fists or rifles could be raised, the door behind him creaked open, and Ahioka stepped forward into the morning light, her posture straight despite the faint scar still marking her side, her gaze sweeping across the men with a calm that unsettled them, for they expected fear, perhaps tears, but instead they found dignity carved into every line of her face, and the silence that followed was sudden, sharp, as though the prairie itself held its breath. She spoke slowly, her English halting but strong, each word deliberate. "I am not enemy. I want peace." And though her accent bent the syllables, the meaning cut through as clear as any sermon, and for a moment the men faltered, shifting uneasily, caught off guard by the strength and serenity of the woman they had turned into a monster in their minds. And Caleb, standing beside her, felt pride swell in his chest at her courage, even as fear gnawed at him for what might follow. One of the men spat into the dirt, muttering that words could not erase blood. But even he did not raise his hand, for there was something in her presence that stilled their violence, a reminder of humanity they had tried to bury beneath prejudice. And as the storm winds began to rise, rattling the grass and stirring dust around their boots, the men exchanged uncertain glances before retreating a step, not satisfied but not emboldened enough to force the issue, and with gruff warnings they mounted up again, riding back toward town with their judgment trailing like thunderclouds, leaving Caleb and Ahioka standing side by side at the threshold of his cabin, the danger not vanished, but momentarily stayed by the power of her calm defiance. And in that fragile silence Caleb knew the clash of their two worlds was far from over. But he also knew that together they had faced it and endured, and that knowledge, fleeting though it was, carried the strength of a vow. It happened in the heart of town, under the blistering noon sun that bleached the dirt street pale and made every sound ring sharper, when Caleb, weary of whispers and ambushes of suspicion, rode in with Ahioka at his side, her posture proud though the weight of every stare pressed against her, and the saloon doors swung open as men spilled out, their mutters already rising like a swarm of angry bees, voices buzzing about shame and betrayal. And it was there, with the church bell tolling faintly in the distance, that Caleb dismounted and faced them, his jaw set, his heart pounding hard enough to drown out the cicadas, and though fear clawed at him, he knew there was no more room for silence, no more hiding behind half-truths. So he raised his voice loud enough for every ear to hear. "I will not turn her away, not today, not ever. If you call her enemy, then you call me the same, because I'll stand with her, come what may." And for a moment the street stilled, a hush thick as molasses falling over the crowd, broken only by the creak of leather and the shifting of boots, and the weight of his words hung heavy, like a line drawn in the dust that none could ignore. Some scoffed openly, spitting into the dirt, muttering curses about fools blinded by a woman's face, and one rancher barked out a bitter laugh, saying Caleb was as good as digging his own grave. But in the back of the crowd, others did not laugh, their eyes lingering longer, softer, some with quiet admiration they dared not voice, for in his defiance they glimpsed a strength they lacked, the courage to name mercy as love and stand firm in it. And though none would step forward then, Caleb felt the shift like a subtle wind across the prairie, a change that might grow in time. Ahioka stood close to him, her hand brushing his arm, her chin lifted with dignity that gave his words weight, and in her silence there was agreement, her presence a testament to the bond no one could erase. And though the sheriff himself watched from across the street, expression grim, he did not move to stop them, only nodded once, as if acknowledging a truth too stubborn to fight. Caleb's heart hammered as he turned back toward his horse, feeling the burn of every eye, knowing some would never forgive. That danger still lurked in the bitterness of neighbors who saw his choice as betrayal. Yet he also felt lighter, freer, because what once lived only in the secrecy of his cabin was now carved into the open air, undeniable. And as he mounted up with Ahioka at his side, the dust rising beneath their horses' hooves, He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but he had crossed a point of no return, and in that crossing he had found something stronger than fear, a conviction that bound him to her fate as surely as the sun bound the prairie to its heat. The days that followed their public stand unfurled like chapters written in defiance, each sunrise sharpening the line Caleb and Ahioka had drawn together, and though the town's judgment lingered in sidelong glares, muttered insults, and doors that no longer opened when Caleb rode past, the cabin on the edge of the prairie became something else entirely, a place not of hiding but of living, a sanctuary forged in firelight and stubborn love, where duty slowly unraveled into something richer, something undeniable. Ahioka, her wound fully healed, could have left once her strength returned, could have vanished into the horizon where her people still moved like shadows through the hills. But instead she chose to remain, and that choice spoke louder than any oath. Her presence beside Caleb no longer the consequence of mercy but the fruit of devotion, and together they carved a rhythm that made survival feel almost like abundance, she teaching him which herbs soothed fevers, which roots hid water beneath the dry earth, how to read the sky for storms before they broke, and he teaching her the stubborn ways of ranch life, the patience of mending fences, the small pride in coaxing life from barren soil. Their bond deepened not in secrecy but in deliberate defiance of those who wished them apart. For when they rode into town together, Ahioka seated tall on Caleb's spare mare, her hair braided with the beads she had salvaged, her chin lifted with dignity, they did not flinch at the stares that followed them, nor at the mutters that trailed like dust in their wake. And when Caleb met the eyes of those who spat at the ground as he passed, he did not lower his gaze but returned it steady, a silent declaration that no man's prejudice could rewrite what they had claimed. At night, when the prairie grew still and the stars bloomed wide across the sky, they would sit by the fire outside the cabin, speaking in broken words stitched together by gestures and laughter, her halting English warming with time, his clumsy attempts at her language making her smile despite herself. And though their worlds had been shaped by loss and division, here they found a middle ground, fragile yet enduring, a union the prairie itself seemed to bless with its vast silence. There were moments when fear still pricked at Caleb's heart, the thought of violence from bitter men, the memory of the sheriff's warnings, but those fears always softened when Ahioka placed her hand over his, her touch steady as stone, and he knew then that whatever storms came, they would face them not as strangers forced together by chance but as partners bound by choice. And so their love took root in defiance, each day a declaration that hearts could bridge what hatred sought to keep apart. And as the wind swept over the grasslands, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain, the prairie itself bore witness to a bond that had grown beyond scandal or whispers, a bond that no law or prejudice could unmake. Seasons rolled across the prairie like great turning wheels, carrying with them both hardship and renewal, and as winter's bite gave way to spring, Caleb began to see a change in his land that mirrored the change in his heart. For where once his ranch had been brittle and dying, touched by drought and neglect, Ahioka's presence breathed a quiet resilience into every acre, her knowledge of plants and waterholes, of how to work with the rhythms of the earth instead of against them, gradually transforming struggle into survival. Together they planted corn in a patch of soil Caleb had long thought useless, and by midsummer the stalks stood proud and green, fed by hidden streams she had shown him how to tap, while the cattle, guided to better grazing routes she remembered from her people's paths, grew fuller, their hides sleek once more, and in the evenings when they walked the fence line side by side, the setting sun painting their shadows long across the grass, Caleb would glance at her and marvel at how she had stitched herself not only into his life, but into the very fabric of the land he had once nearly lost. The town, of course, did not soften. Quickly whispers still followed them whenever they rode in for supplies. Children stared wide-eyed while their parents pulled them close, and men at the saloon muttered darkly about betrayal. But there were cracks in the wall of judgment too, cracks that widened slowly as some noticed Caleb's ranch thriving again, as others saw the way Ahioka carried herself with quiet dignity, answering coldness with grace. And while no open acceptance came, neither did the violent reckoning many had once threatened, for perhaps even prejudice grew weary when faced with love that refused to break. Through it all, Caleb and Ahioka chose not to hide, their bond no longer an act of rebellion but a simple fact of life, and on nights when the sky shimmered with endless stars, they would sit by the fire outside the cabin, her head resting against his shoulder as he spoke of the future he dared to dream now, a ranch restored, a family perhaps, a life not free of hardship but rich with meaning, and she, in turn, would share quiet songs of her people, melodies that spoke of endurance and hope, and together those dreams and songs wove a tapestry of belonging that neither frontier law nor town gossip could unravel. By autumn, when the fields glowed golden and the air carried the scent of harvest, Caleb understood fully what he had gained, not only the salvation of his ranch but the salvation of himself, lifted from loneliness and despair into a love that defied the world's scorn. And as he walked hand in hand with Ahyoka across the prairie, their figures framed against the vast horizon, it was clear that what they carried was more than survival, more than defiance. It was proof that love could take root in the hardest soil, bloom in the face of prejudice, and endure with the strength of the land itself, unyielding, eternal,